The Los Angeles airport was bustling with its usual mix of hurried passengers, rolling luggage, and overlapping conversations. Among the chaos, Jason Statham stood in the first-class line, his demeanor calm and his appearance modest. Dressed in a plain black t-shirt, weathered jeans, and scuffed boots, Jason carried a single backpack that looked like it had been around the world. There was nothing flashy about him, no designer logos, no sparkling accessories. He seemed almost out of place against the backdrop of sharp suits, designer handbags, and luxury luggage that surrounded him. Yet there was something about him that drew quiet attention. It wasn't just his rugged good looks or his muscular build, but the aura he carried, one of a man who had faced life's challenges and come out stronger. He stood with an unshakable calm, observing the chaos around him with a kind of quiet amusement. A few spots behind Jason in line stood Victor Langley, a real estate mogul known for his sharp suits and even sharper tongue. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit and gleaming leather shoes, Victor radiated confidence, or perhaps arrogance. His gold watch and meticulously styled hair completed the image of a man who wanted to be noticed. Victor's eyes scanned the first-class line like a predator sizing up his surroundings. When his gaze landed on Jason, his lips curled into a smirk. To Victor, Jason's simple attire and rugged backpack seemed almost offensive in a place meant for the elite. Leaning toward the passenger beside him, Victor whispered just loudly enough to be overheard. "First class isn't what it used to be. You'd think they'd have standards." Jason caught the comment but didn't react. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, as if Victor's words didn't matter. Victor, emboldened by Jason's silence, stepped closer as the line advanced. "First class, huh?" he said directly, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess they're letting just anyone in these days." Jason turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze meeting Victor's. His face remained calm, his voice steady as he replied, "The world's full of surprises." Victor's smirk faltered for a moment. He had expected indignation, maybe even anger, but Jason's unbothered tone caught him off guard. As the line crept forward, Victor couldn't resist taking another jab. He adjusted his cufflinks and smiled smugly. "Nothing personal," he began, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. "But you don't really look like the type who flies first class. No offense, of course." Jason glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "None taken," he said simply. Victor chuckled softly, clearly disappointed by Jason's lack of reaction. "You know," he continued, "it's rare to see someone so casual in this section. Most of us," he gestured to himself, "know how to make an impression." Jason's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Sometimes, not making an impression is the best way to travel." Victor blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond. The subtle jab in Jason's reply wasn't lost on him, but before he could muster a comeback, the boarding announcement interrupted them. As the first-class line began to move, Jason and Victor found themselves walking side by side. Jason's steps were steady, his pace unhurried, while Victor strode confidently, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Victor, unable to resist one last remark, leaned toward Jason. "You know, some people get lucky enough to sit up here," he said, his voice low but pointed. "But not everyone belongs." Jason turned to him with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the encounter. "Maybe, or maybe belonging isn't about where you sit, but how you carry yourself." Victor frowned, clearly dissatisfied. As they handed their tickets to the attendant and stepped onto the jet bridge, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing some invisible battle. Jason, meanwhile, walked with quiet confidence, unaware, or perhaps uninterested, in Victor's simmering frustration. For him, the interaction was over. But for Victor, the game was just beginning. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendant began her rounds in first class, offering refreshments to the exclusive passengers. Victor wasted no time making his presence known, flashing a confident smile as the attendant approached. "A glass of champagne," he said, his tone as polished as his appearance. "Only the best for first class, right?" The flight attendant nodded, returning a professional smile. She turned to Jason next. And for you, sir? Jason looked up from his seat and gave her a polite nod. Just water, please. Victor couldn't resist. He leaned toward Jason, chuckling softly. Water? Really? First class has all these perks, and you go for water. Jason accepted the bottle from the flight attendant and responded with calm simplicity. I'm fine with this. Sometimes, simplicity is enough. Victor leaned back, crossing his arms with a smirk. That's unique, he said, his tone laden with sarcasm. But I guess some people don't really know how to enjoy the finer things in life. Jason unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and took a sip, his expression remaining serene. The finer things aren't always about what's in the glass, he said, glancing at Victor. Sometimes it's about the journey. Victor scoffed, shaking his head. That's a nice thought, but let's be honest. People don't fly first class for simplicity. They fly to enjoy the exclusivity, the best that life has to offer. That's what separates us from, he gestured vaguely toward the back of the plane, everyone else. Jason met Victor's gaze, unbothered by his condescending tone. Maybe what separates us isn't the seat we're in, but how we act while we're sitting there. Victor opened his mouth to reply but found himself momentarily speechless. Jason turned his attention back to the window, effectively ending the exchange. Victor shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled by Jason's calm demeanor. He wasn't used to being outmaneuvered in a conversation, especially by someone he had already decided was beneath him. Determined to regain the upper hand, he leaned toward Jason again. You know, he began, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone, life's a lot like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you enjoy the rewards. But let's face it, not everyone belongs here. Some people just get lucky. Jason turned to him, his expression unreadable. Luck has its place, he said slowly, but it doesn't explain everything. Sometimes where you end up has more to do with how you carry yourself. Victor smirked. That's a nice way to justify it. But in the real world, success isn't about carrying yourself a certain way. It's about proving you belong. That's how you make it. Jason took another sip of water, unperturbed. Sometimes, the loudest people are the ones trying the hardest to prove they belong. Victor's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. Well, it's better than pretending you don't care. By now, the quiet tension between Jason and Victor had begun to attract the attention of other passengers. A few in the surrounding seats exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval toward Victor's arrogant demeanor. Jason, however, seemed entirely unaffected by the growing audience. He remained composed, his calm responses carrying more weight than Victor's increasingly sharp remarks. Victor, oblivious to the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, leaned closer to Jason. You've got some interesting ideas, he said, his tone laced with mockery. But let's be honest, success isn't about humility or simplicity. It's about standing out, being the best, and showing it. Jason leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. His voice was steady as he replied, True success doesn't need to shout. It speaks for itself. Victor's confident smirk began to waver. Around them, a few passengers nodded subtly, their silent support for Jason growing more evident. Victor, however, wasn't ready to back down. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and though Victor continued to act as though he was in control, the reactions of those around him told a different story. Jason's calm strength was shifting the balance, leaving Victor visibly unsettled. The tension in the first-class cabin had grown thick, with passengers discreetly observing the ongoing exchange. Victor, still determined to assert his dominance, leaned back in his seat with a self-satisfied smirk. You know, he said, breaking the silence, people who talk about humility and simplicity are usually the ones who have nothing to show for themselves. Jason turned to Victor, his expression calm but now tinged with something deeper. Patience. And I've noticed, Jason began, his voice steady, that the people who talk the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The cabin fell silent as Jason's words hung in the air. Victor's confident expression faltered, if only for a moment. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Victor forced an awkward laugh, clearly attempting to recover his composure. That's a nice sentiment, but let's be real. The world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people overlook you. That's just how it works. Jason took a moment before replying, as though carefully choosing his words. Maybe, but I think real success doesn't need to be shown off. It speaks for itself in the way you live, the way you treat others. Victor shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. He glanced around the cabin, noticing that several passengers were now watching them openly. The subtle nods and approving looks directed at Jason only added to his discomfort. Victor's forced confidence was starting to waver, but he wasn't ready to concede. That's easy to say when you've got nothing to prove, he muttered. Jason gave a small smile, turning back to the window. Or maybe it's easier when you realize there's nothing worth proving. Victor, frustrated by his inability to rattle Jason, leaned forward, lowering his voice. You know what I think? Life is like flying first class. It's about proving you're on a higher level, separating yourself from everyone else. Jason turned to Victor, his expression calm but resolute. And I think the real world is made by people, Victor. It's not about being above anyone. It's about how we treat those around us. That says more about who we are than anything we own. Victor narrowed his eyes, his irritation bubbling to the surface. That sounds like something someone without much to their name would say. Jason didn't flinch. Maybe, he replied. Or maybe it's something you realize when you've seen enough to know what really matters. The passengers around them had fallen silent, their attention fully captured by the exchange. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. Victor clenched his fists, his voice rising slightly. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here. Jason nodded slowly. You're right. I don't know your story, but I've met a lot of people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill something missing inside. Victor froze, the words hitting him harder than he wanted to admit. His eyes flicked downward, and he began fiddling with the cuff of his shirt. For a moment, the arrogant facade he wore so proudly began to crack. That's not me, Victor said finally, his voice quieter but still defensive. I worked hard for everything I have. I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. Jason observed Victor carefully before speaking. I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in showing what we've achieved that we forget to ask ourselves an important question. Who are we without all of this? Victor's jaw tightened, his mind clearly racing. We're what we build, he said firmly. Without it, we're nothing. Jason's expression shifted slightly, becoming more serious. I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not what we accumulate. In the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside. Victor sat back, his arms crossed, but his discomfort was impossible to hide. Around them, passengers exchanged quiet glances. Jason's words had shifted the atmosphere, creating a sense of calm that contrasted with Victor's growing unease. For the first time, Victor found himself at a loss for words. His earlier confidence felt hollow, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Jason's calm demeanor had left him exposed in a way he hadn't expected. The flight had settled into an uneasy quiet following the tension-filled exchange. Jason remained calm, gazing out the window as though nothing had happened. Victor, on the other hand, sat rigidly, his expression a mix of frustration and unease. A short while later, the flight attendant returned to their section with a polite smile. She stopped beside Jason, her voice clear and professional. Mr. Statham, the captain asked me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards. The mention of Jason's name echoed through the cabin, sending ripples of recognition among the passengers. Several turned their heads, their eyes widening in surprise. A quiet murmur spread as people pieced together who he was. Victor froze, the name ringing in his ears. Statham? He whispered, his disbelief evident. His gaze snapped to Jason, who gave the flight attendant a polite nod and thanked her without any hint of ego. Victor stared, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "Wait, you're Jason Statham?" he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason turned to Victor, his calm expression unchanging. "Something wrong?" he asked, his tone polite but pointed. Victor's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind raced as he replayed their earlier conversations, realizing just how badly he had misjudged the man sitting beside him. I had no idea," Victor stammered. "You didn't say who you were." Jason tilted his head slightly. "I didn't think it was necessary," he replied. "I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor flushed a deep red, the weight of his earlier arrogance crashing down on him. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the way other passengers were now looking at him, not with admiration, but with thinly veiled disapproval. "I didn't mean anything by it," Victor muttered, fumbling for an excuse. I didn't realize." Jason leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth isn't about who you're speaking to. It's about how you treat people." Victor sat back in his seat, visibly deflated. The murmurs of the other passengers only deepened his humiliation as he struggled to meet Jason's gaze. For the next several minutes, Victor sat in silence, staring at his hands. The arrogance he had displayed at the start of the flight now felt like a distant memory. He replayed Jason's words in his head, each one chipping away at the image he had crafted of himself. Finally, Victor took a deep breath and turned to Jason. "I need to apologize," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Not because of who you are, but because I was wrong. I acted like an arrogant fool. I judged you without knowing a thing about you." Jason regarded him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate the apology," he said. "But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. Jason's calm, steady demeanor only made the lesson hit harder. As the plane began its descent, Victor couldn't help but glance at Jason. The man's calm strength and unshakable sense of self had left a profound impression on him. When the plane landed, Jason stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment. Victor, mustering his courage, turned to him one last time. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "not just for handling me with patience, but for making me realize how far off track I've been." Jason paused, looking Victor in the eye. "Sometimes what we're searching for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves," he said. "I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle over him. As Jason exited the plane, a few passengers discreetly approached him in the terminal, asking for autographs and photos. Jason greeted them with patience and genuine kindness, his humility shining through. Victor watched from a distance, his mind racing. Jason hadn't flaunted his fame or power. He had let his actions speak for him. The lesson was clear. Success wasn't about wealth or status, but about how you treated others. Victor sighed, glancing at his reflection in the terminal window. For the first time in years, he felt ready to change. As the passengers from the flight dispersed into the bustling terminal, the weight of what had transpired lingered with Victor. His mind was awash with Jason's words, each one carrying a depth of meaning he couldn't ignore. For so long, Victor had equated success with wealth, power, and being seen as superior to others. But Jason's calm strength and wisdom had redefined it. True success, he realized, wasn't about outward appearances or possessions. It was about the impact one left on others, the respect one earned through kindness, not dominance. Victor thought back to the way Jason had handled the situation. Despite being provoked repeatedly, Jason had never once lost his composure. He hadn't tried to prove himself or flaunt his status. Instead, he had responded with patience and dignity, letting his words and actions speak for themselves. Victor glanced at the people around him in the terminal, now seeing them in a new light. How many had he judged unfairly? How many had he dismissed as unworthy simply because they didn't meet his arbitrary standards? Jason's humility had shown him that true power lay not in belittling others but in uplifting them. As Victor retrieved his luggage, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had been more than a coincidence. It felt like a wake-up call, a chance to reevaluate his life and his values. He thought back to Jason's parting words. Sometimes, what we're searching for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. Those words echoed in his mind, challenging him to look inward. For the first time, Victor felt ready to confront the insecurities that had driven him to act the way he did. Victor glanced at his reflection in the glass doors of the terminal. "It's time to do better," he murmured to himself, taking a deep breath as he stepped outside into the warm sunlight. Meanwhile, Jason moved through the terminal with the same quiet humility that had defined him throughout the flight. A few fans approached him, asking for photos and autographs. Jason greeted each one with a genuine smile, taking his time to ensure they felt seen and appreciated. Victor watched from a distance, marveling at how Jason carried himself. Despite his fame, he treated everyone with respect and kindness, never once acting as though he were above anyone. For Victor, the moment was transformative. He realized that Jason's true strength didn't come from his status or achievements, but from his ability to connect with others on a human level. As the terminal buzzed with activity, Victor stood still for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew that this encounter had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Jason's words, his actions, and his unwavering humility had left an indelible mark on him. Victor walked away with a newfound sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He resolved to carry the lessons he had learned, not just in his actions but in how he approached the world. Jason Statham's legacy in that moment wasn't about his fame or accomplishments. It was about the lesson he left behind, that true success is defined by how we treat others, the respect we earn through humility, and the impact we leave on the lives we touch. As Victor disappeared into the crowd, the question lingered. Are we living to impress others, or to become better people? Jason's example was a reminder that the answer lay not in what we show the world, but in how we choose to live each day.